The opening scene depicts a historical event during World War I in 1917, specifically focusing on the conflict between Germany and France. Tragically, we learn that numerous young soldiers have already lost their lives. Prior to placing the deceased German soldiers into coffins, their uniforms are removed and sent for washing. Afterwards, the uniforms are sewn onto new clothing, which will be worn by the next batch of soldiers. It has been 3 years since the war began, and we are introduced to a 17-year-old boy named Paul Bäumer, who, along with his school friends Albert Kropp, Franz Müller, and Ludwig Bem, enlists their names in the Imperial German Army. It is revealed that Paul's mother has forbidden him from joining the army, but Franz convinces him to forge her signature on the approval letter. One day, the group listens to a patriotic speech by a school official, after which they receive their uniforms, unaware of the fact that they belong to the fallen soldiers from a previous battle. Oblivious to the harsh realities and cruelty of the battlefield, these young boys are motivated to go to war, only to be perceived as cool people in the eyes of the public. The next day, the boys are deployed to northern France near La Malmaison. After arrival at the base camp, a doctor blocks their path and asks that the soldiers vacate their vehicle in order to transport injured comrades to the hospital. From there, they all proceed to walk towards the battlefield. After a long walk, they reach their hiding spot, where they meet other soldiers and a vice commander named Stanislaus Kaczynski. During their first night in the trenches, Paul and Albert are assigned to keep watch. A short while later, they hear footsteps and become alert, so Paul prepares his weapon and scans the area for any signs of movement. Upon spotting something amiss, he instinctively opens fire, inadvertently revealing their location. In response, the enemy retaliates and shoots at Paul's head, but fortunately, his helmet shields him from the bullet. The next second, the enemies launch a brutal attack, forcing all the German soldiers to seek refuge inside a bunker. As the assault intensifies, Paul and his friends are forced to hide since they lack advanced weaponry to counter the enemy. The boys' idealized perception of war crumbles as they confront its grim realities. Unfortunately, due to the continuous bombarding, the bunker collapses, trapping and killing some of the soldiers under the rubble. In the morning, Paul, who is still buried under debris, is rescued by Albert and the other soldiers. Overwhelmed and traumatized, Paul takes a moment to rest. It is during this time that Stanislaus, a compassionate leader unlike the others, offers Paul a piece of bread and lets him know about the horrors of war. Shortly after, Paul is assigned to the task of retrieving identification tags from the deceased soldiers' necks. While doing so, he comes across the lifeless body of his friend Ludwig, which brings him to tears. Paul takes a moment to grieve and mourn the loss before continuing with his task. The scene then shifts to 18 months later, where we witness a meeting between a German state secretary named Matthias Erzberger and the German High Command. Erzberger, weary of the mounting losses, tries to convince the High Command to initiate armistice negotiations with the Allied powers. Back on the battlefield, Paul appears to have grown accustomed to the harsh reality of war. One day, while walking with Stanislaus, they stumble upon a small farm near the forest. Craving to eat something tasty after a long time, they plan to steal livestock from the farm. Stanislaus enters the premises while Paul keeps a watch outside. After successfully stealing a pet, they quickly run away from the scene. They then return to the base and cook the stolen food. Albert, Franz, and another soldier named Jaden join them and have a wonderful meal. Amidst this, they also joke and laugh, creating a joyful atmosphere and forgetting the bitter reality of war for some time. That farmer is pissed though. The following morning, as the soldiers prepare their breakfast, they spot 3 women passing by. Having been deprived of female companionship for a long time, they are captivated by their presence. Franz even goes a step further and approaches the women, offering to escort them home. Later that day, the soldiers receive letters from their families. Since Stanislaus is illiterate, he asks Paul to read a letter from his wife. The letter describes how much she misses Stanislaus and her desire for them to visit their son's grave together. After hearing this, Stanislaus says that he feels like a loser, as his child had been sick for an extended period of time before passing away, but he was unable to visit his son even for a single time. Furthermore, he worries that he will be unable to reintegrate into peacetime society. According to Stanislaus, the government's promises of substantial salaries have trapped them, but in reality, the actual value of the wages is worthless, especially considering the uncertainty of survival until the war's end. That same night, Franz returns to his fellow soldiers and recounts his experience with the women. He brings a handkerchief belonging to one of them as a keepsake, offering it to Paul to sniff it and experience the woman's scent. Don't laugh, it's not perverted. It's touching. The next day, Paul, Albert, Franz, Stanislaus, and Jaden are assigned the task of locating the dead bodies of 60 soldiers who fell during the recent attack in France near an abandoned rail track. While searching, Stanislaus detects a lingering trace of poisonous gas used by the French earlier. Suspecting that the soldiers may have sought shelter in the area, the group enters a nearby warehouse. They carefully search the area and eventually discover a room containing the lifeless bodies of all 60 soldiers. Upon witnessing the horrific sight, Stanislaus says that the soldiers must have succumbed to an excessive dose of poisonous gas, likely due to premature removal of their gas masks. On the other hand, Erzberger and some other German delegates board a train to the forest of Compiègne for ceasefire negotiations. However, a general named Friedrichs opposes the idea of armistice talks, believing that the French will seek unfair terms. He still hopes that Germany can win the war, despite lacking advanced equipment. As a result, General Friedrichs instructs his men to prepare for an attack before French reinforcements arrive. That night, Erzberger and the delegates arrive at the forest of Compiègne, while Paul's regiment is dispatched to the front lines to prepare for an assault on the French. The next morning, the German delegates, led by Erzberger, meet with their French counterparts and request a ceasefire, highlighting the significant loss of German soldiers in the conflict. The French Supreme Allied Commander presents a negotiation contract, granting the Germans 72 hours to accept the non-negotiable terms imposed by the Allies. However, until the treaty is signed, the war will continue unabated. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the German soldiers initiate their attack, engaging in fierce, close-quarters combat to secure the French front line. Unfortunately, their progress is short-lived as they face a combined arms counterattack, with the French using Saint-Chamond tanks to overpower the German defenses. Despite their attempts to fight back against the tanks, the German soldiers' bullets have minimal effect, leaving them vulnerable as the tanks relentlessly crush their positions. In addition, the French soldiers use advanced flamethrowers to torch their enemies, and poor Albert becomes one of the victims of the flames. Paul, witnessing this horrifying sight, experiences a wave of panic, but manages to continue retreating back to their trench. Once he gets there, the commander immediately orders Paul to gather as much ammunition as possible and retreat. Without time for contemplation, Paul hastily does as asked and begins to run towards safety. But unfortunately, along the way, he falls into a crater in the treacherous no man's land. Now, with the enemies approaching, he acts quickly and pretends to be dead, but to his dismay, he notices a French soldier standing behind him, poised to shoot. It appears as if Paul is going to meet his end, but just then, a German comrade arrives at the scene and shoots the French soldier, causing him to fall into the same crater. Seizing this opportunity, Paul grabs his knife and repeatedly stabs the French soldier. As Paul watches him die slowly, he becomes overwhelmed by guilt, so he begs for forgiveness from the lifeless body. While searching the French soldier's belongings, Paul discovers a photograph of the soldier's family. This only intensifies his guilt, and he begins crying like a baby. Back in the train, the German delegates go through the terms of negotiation, which seems to corner Germany. Hence, a senior official objects, stating that signing the agreement would be seen as surrender. He would rather lose the war with honor. However, Erzberger argues that the decision should not be based solely on winning or losing, but on the thousands of young German soldiers who are desperately fighting a war which is unwinnable. A few hours after sending the agreement copies to the higher government officials, Erzberger receives instructions from the field marshal to accept the Allied terms. Following this, the delegates from both countries meet for further negotiations. Erzberger assures the French delegates that their government will make every effort to fulfill France's conditions. He, along with the two other German delegates, signs an armistice agreement set to take effect at 11 a.m. the very next day. With this, the French delegates finally declare the end of the war. Elsewhere, Paul makes his way back to the base and discovers the soldiers rejoicing over the impending end of the war. Inside the medical facility, he finds Jaden, who is seriously wounded in the legs. It appears as if he is never going to walk again. Jaden then brings out Franz's scarf and reveals that the poor boy also succumbed to his injuries. Devastated by the loss of his friends, Paul ties Franz's handkerchief around his neck as a tribute. With a heavy heart, he then heads to the kitchen, where he reunites with Stanislaus. Together, they bring food for Jaden and provide him with a spoon and fork to eat up. Tragically, Jaden, who is distraught at being crippled, commits the unthinkable with the same fork. The following morning, the news of the official ceasefire reaches the soldiers at the base camp. As Paul awakens, he finds Stanislaus staring out of the window. When questioned, Stanislaus expresses that it is the most peaceful day since he came to the war, because for the first time in 4 years, he hasn't heard a single sound of gunshots. In order to celebrate their newfound freedom, the two friends decide to steal from the farm once more. Along the way, Stanislaus excitedly says that he cannot wait to return home and hug his beloved wife tightly. After some time walking, they finally arrive at the farm. Paul silently gets inside while Stanislaus guard. Paul comes across some duck eggs and stuffs them in his pocket, but during this, he is apprehended by a young boy who quickly summons his father. The latter realizes that he is again being robbed, so he grabs his gun and opens fire on Paul. Luckily, the two soldiers manage to escape unscathed. Once at a safe distance, they crack open the eggs and take turns eating them. As Stanislaus steps away to take a leak in the forest, the farm owner's son suddenly appears from behind, aiming his gun at them. The next second, Paul hears a gunshot, so he rushes to Stanislaus, only to find him wounded. The bullet appears to have penetrated the right part of his stomach. Horrified, Paul carries his injured comrade back to the base for medical aid, but despite his best efforts, Stanislaus tragically passes away due to excessive loss of blood. This shatters Paul, as he has now witnessed the loss of all of his friends. The war has totally broken him. Later on, all the soldiers are called to assemble in the courtyard, where General Friedrichs delivers news that they will soon be returning home back to their families. However, in a surprising twist, Friedrichs, driven by his desire for a German victory, contemplates one final attack to commence at 10:45 a.m., just before the scheduled ceasefire at 11. He orders the soldiers to capture territory before the ceasefire takes effect, disregarding the potential loss of lives it would lead. Despite their reservations, the soldiers are compelled to obey these higher orders. In the next scene, the soldiers reluctantly make their way back to the battlefield, launching the attack precisely at 10:45 a.m. as per the order. Paul engages in combat, relentlessly eliminating as many French soldiers as possible. In the midst of the chaos, Paul comes to the aid of a young German recruit, but in the process, he becomes the target of a French soldier. Both Paul and the French soldier tumble into a bunker. As they stand face to face, they freeze for a moment, hoping that the clock will strike 11. However, their encounter is abruptly interrupted when another French soldier fatally stabs Paul right in the heart from behind. Seconds later, the war is officially declared over, and the sound of commanders' voices shouting "ceasefire" resonates through the air. With his last bit of strength, Paul stumbles out into the trenches, relishing the end of the war, before finally succumbing to his injuries. A short while later, a newly arrived German recruit, whom Paul had previously saved, is tasked with collecting identification tags from fallen soldiers. As the recruit carries out this grim duty, he comes across Paul's lifeless, mud-covered body. In a gesture of respect, he picks up Franz's scarf from him and wraps it around his own neck. However, the recruit chooses not to take Paul's ID tag, resulting in his death going unrecorded. This means that the brave Paul will forever remain unknown in official records.